We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to The Anadromist. This is Burn Power in Tbilisi, Georgia, coming to you on a very dark autumn night near Halloween. Although when you listen to this, it's going to be past Halloween, I'm certain, because I'm not going to just record it and put it out. I'm going to throw it out into the future. Well, today we've got a special treat. I have once again spent many hours editing one of the lectures I've been given permission to reproduce for you by the late and great Dutch art historian Hans Rookmaaker. I am very clearly influenced by Hans Rookmaaker. Much of my own work, particularly in music, but also in art, has a lot of my starting point comes from him. When you listen to this, for many of you, this will be the first time you've ever thought about the Jazz Age, the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. This is going to be both a history lesson and a musical history lesson. A lot of the music we're going to listen to are old, well, all of the music are old scratchy 78 recordings. I've tried to find better illustrations when I could to substitute for his illustrations. But sometimes he was talking in the middle of the example, and I felt that was more important than finding a new copy of a recording. Digitally edited, but you need to hear the scratches because you're listening through the past. So we're going to listen to this. I have, of course, illustrated this with period accurate illustrations to the degree I could. I hate watching videos when, I'm very attuned to what happened in every year and every month, and I hate watching things that have the wrong dates. And so to the degree possible, I have done that. Sometimes I have fudged. There is no performance footage of Louis Armstrong playing in the 1920s. But we do have some in the early 30s, so I threw that in, although you don't actually hear that music, but you see that. I wanted you to get a flavor of how Louis Armstrong performs. But there's so much else. We'll discuss the Flappers, who were quite rebellious people, and we will go on from there. So it's not an entire history of the Roaring Twenties. It is the relationship between the Roaring Twenties and jazz, and that's what we're going to be listening to. Without any further ado, Hans Rookmaaker talking about the Jazz Age.
So I want to lecture today on jazz, protest, and revolution. The First World War sparked off a decade devoted to illusion and indulgence. Whether one looks at social behavior or the arts, this is a period of extraordinary inventiveness with the common aim of systematically repudiating the past. This period, the period between 1900 and 1930, as a first revolutionary age in our century, is what I want to talk about in relationship to music and jazz. Just to give you a little flavor of that period, I want to give you a nice little quote out of a magazine of that period, a funny magazine, Esquire, something like that, 1920s, and the mother said to the girl, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself wearing so little clothing to a party?" And the flapper, the girl, answers, "Goodness no, mother. If I were ashamed of myself, I wouldn't wear so little clothing to a party." And this is about the setting of that age, which is the first age of permissiveness. So all the things we have been discussing in the past years, and which I've been discussing in my lecture on rock, and protest can be traced back to the first part of the century, and that's what I want to do. Scott Fitzgerald, who was much in this century and in that part of the time, and who was a leading figure, in 1932 wrote a little essay called The Jazz Age. And he says the jazz age is a past age by now. And I want to give you a few quotes out of this article.
It was an age of miracles. It was an age of art. It was an age of excess, and it was an age of satire. A stuffed shirt, squirming to blackmail in a lifelike way, sat upon the throne of the United States. A stylish young man hurried over to represent to us the throne of England. A world of girls yearned for the young Englishman. The old American groaned in his sleep as he waited to be poisoned by his wife, upon the advice of the female Rasputin, who then made the ultimate decision in our national affairs. But such matters apart, we had things our own way at last. With Americans ordering suits by the gross in London, the Bond Street tailors perforce agreed to moderate their cut to the American long-waisted figure and loose-fitting taste. Something subtle passed to America, the style of man. During the Renaissance, Francis I looked to Florence to trim his leg. 17th century England aped the court of France, and 50 years ago the German guards officer bought his civilian clothes in London. Gentleman's clothes, symbol of the power that man must hold and that passes from race to race. We were the most powerful nation. Who could tell us any longer what was fashionable and what was fun? The first social revelation created a sensation out of all proportion to its novelty. As far back as 1915, the unchaperoned young people of the smaller cities had discovered the mobile privacy of that automobile given to young Bill at 16 to make him self-reliant. At first, petting was a desperate adventure, even under such favorable conditions. But presently confidences were exchanged and the old commandment broke down. As early as 1917, there were references to such sweet and casual dalliance in any number of the Yale Record or the Princeton Tiger. But petting in its more audacious manifestations was confined to the wealthier classes. Among other young people, the old standard prevailed until after the war, and a kiss meant that a proposal was expected, as young officers in strange cities sometimes discovered to their dismay. Only in 1920 did the veil finally fall. The jazz age was in flower. Scarcely had the stater citizens of the Republic caught their breaths when the wildest of all generations, the generation which had been adolescent during the confusion of the war, brusquely shouldered any contemporaries out of the way and danced into the limelight. This was the generation whose girls dramatized themselves as flappers, the generation that corrupted its elders and eventually overreached itself less through lack of morals than through lack of taste. May one offer in exhibit the year 1922? That was the peak of the younger generation, for though the jazz age continued, it became less and less an affair of youth. The sequel was like a children's party taken over by the elders, leaving the children puzzled and rather neglected and rather taken aback. By 1923, their elders, tired of watching the carnival with ill-concealed envy, had discovered that young liquor will take the place of young blood, and with a whoop, the orgy began. The younger generation was starved no longer. The jazz age had had a wild youth and a heady middle age. There was the phase of the necking parties, the Leopold Loeb murder. I remember the time my wife was arrested on Queensborough Bridge on the suspicion of being the bobbed-haired bandit, and the John held clothes. In the second phase, such phenomena as sex and murder became more mature, if much more conventional. Middle age must be served, and pajamas came to the beach to save fat thighs and flabby calves from competition with the one-piece bathing suit. Finally, skirts came down and everything was concealed. Everybody was at scratch now. Let's go. But it was not to be. Somebody had blundered, and the most expensive orgy in history was over. It ended 2 years ago because the utter confidence which was its essential prop received an enormous jolt, and it didn't take long for the flimsy structure to settle earthward. And after 2 years, the jazz age seems as far away as the days before the war. It was borrowed time anyhow. The whole upper tenth of a nation living with the insouciance of grand dukes and the casualness of chorus girls. But moralizing is easy now, and it was pleasant to be in one's 20s in such a certain and unworried time.
What's very important is to note that you have a revolutionary generation, but as I tried to trace in the other lecture, it's not only a revolutionary generation, it's not different directions within this, but there's also people who try to shut their eyes and not see these things. These are the people we are calling bourgeois because we don't want to insult the middle class. Well, there are too many people who are not middle class who are very bourgeois, and happily there are some middle class people who are not bourgeois. But the bourgeois mentality was there too in the beginning of this century, and it may be their attitude produced the next revolution. But let's listen on to Scott Fitzgerald as he begins to talk about this.
The word jazz in its progress towards respectability has meant first sex, then dancing, then music. It is associated with a state of nervous stimulation, not unlike that of big cities behind the lines of a war.
There it comes.
There were entire classes, people over 50 for example, who spent a whole decade denying its existence, even when its puckish face peered into the family circle. Never did they dream that they had contributed to it. The honest citizens of every class who believed in a strict public morality and were powerful enough to enforce the necessary legislation did not know that they would necessarily be served by criminals and quacks, and do not really believe it today. Rich righteousness had always been able to buy honest and intelligent servants to free the slaves or the Cubans. So when this attempt collapsed, our elders stood firm with all the stubbornness of people involved in a weak case, preserving their righteousness and losing their children. Silver-haired women and men with fine old faces, people who never did a consciously dishonest thing in their lives, still assure each other in the apartment hotels of New York and Boston and Washington that there is a whole generation growing up that will never know the taste of liquor. Meanwhile, their granddaughters pass the well-thumbed copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover around the boarding school, and if they get about at all, know the taste of gin or corn at 16. But the generation who reached maturity between 1875 and 1895 continued to believe what they wanted to believe. The people over 30, the people all the way up to 50, had joined the dance. We graybeards, to tread down FPA, remember the uproar when in 1912 grandmothers of 40 tossed away their crutches and took lessons in the tango and the castle walk. A dozen years later, a woman might pack the green hat with her other affairs as she set off for Europe or New York. But Savonarola was too busy flogging dead horses in Augean stables of his own creation to notice. For a while, bootleg Negro records with their phallic euphemisms made everything suggestive, and simultaneously came a wave of erotic plays. Young girls from finishing schools packed the galleries to hear about the romance of being a lesbian, and George G. Nathan protested.
End of quote. Yes, we turn it around. So, just this is an introduction to what I want to talk about. It's Scott Fitzgerald, who just is reminiscing on his own life and work. And there was a kind of revolution, the revolution of the 60s that we at L'Abri have been talking about so much. We must understand is only part of a much larger revolution. And if we feel at this moment that the impetus of this revolution is softening down, it's not that strong anymore, there are counter forces, romanticism coming in again, then it's good to realize that the end is not yet there, but there's much more to come. So in a way, it began around 1900 and reached its peak in the 20s, and then in the early 30s it fell down. Of course, depression was part of this, and then it went up again after the Second World War. 1955, rock and roll, the 60s, Beatles, Bob Dylan, and so on, and of course the riots and the difficulties at the universities and many more things, and then now today we go down again and things become normal, as Scott Fitzgerald said a few moments ago. But it is a kind of disillusionment, and people feel we have lost our youth, and the next generation is to come in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years. Nobody knows when it will be much further, much stronger, much deeper, much more comprehensive, and maybe someday they will reach the point that the whole world is changed, and the older generation, the bourgeois, have been pushed out of the limelight. So there's something happening, and you question what is happening. My thesis in my book on modern art is this: in the 18th century, something happened very deeply. Man placed God, religion, out of the center of life. It's not important. It's very good for your Sunday. It's very good to go to heaven. But today we have something else that's more important. And because of this, there's something happening to man. It's not just theory, it is not just theology, it's not just philosophy, but it's life. And we see the life forces go. And man himself in the end testifies, man is dead. But this deadness, this sickness to death is coming very soon. And in the end of the 19th century, if we think about one very special phenomenon, which is the expression of man, his popular music is really dead. It is the most awful, most horrible nothingness that you can imagine if you think about the popular music around 1900. And Western society, because man is man, wants to have something which is really good, which is really, really deep, and at the same time really joyful, music that is real and has life. And they could find it in this Western culture, because for some strange reasons there were the black people around who, just because they were denied all kinds of education, had not been entered into this post-Enlightenment world and were in a way still pre-Enlightenment. And so the Western world, needing an iron pill, took the iron pill there where it could find it, and they found it in the black music. And in a way my lecture is that the white man tries to get this pill, and he swallows it, but he cannot swallow it because he is already too sick and dead even to swallow this and get revived again. So that's why it doesn't work. In a way, the whole revolution that I'm talking about, this first revolution and the second revolution in the 50s, is a great tragedy, because they revolt against the results of something which is in their own minds. They revolt against something, and they have no background, no base, no foundation, no thrust in another direction. So whatever they do, they always make it worse instead of better. So let's now run into the lecture proper and listen first. It began all in 1896 when there was going to be a hot time in town tonight.
And she's all dressed in red. I just hope and kissed her, and to me then she said, please, oh, do not let me go. You are mine, and I love you best of all. You'll be my man, I'll have no man at all. There'll be a hard time in old town tonight, my baby, when you...
Well, how did the anemic, almost dead, white culture, Western society, post-Enlightenment, music, and the entertainment, because entertainment is very serious. In a way, the word in the same itself is a hateful thing. Music is very important, and entertainment is the most important thing in life for everybody in all ages, except for the 20th century. They make it cheap. But how did this cheap music, this dead music sounded? Well, here you have something just out of around 1900. This man already had swallowed a little bit of the iron pill, a little bit. But the real iron pill came in 1899 with Scott Joplin, one of the greatest of the American composers. Scott Joplin, who made a composition, ragtime we call it, and it's the Maple Leaf Rag. And this was the first hit in our century, the Maple Leaf Rag, who was what I would call the iron pill. And people began to dance on this music. This is not just music to be listened to, but this is music to be danced. And so for the first time we get this fusion of popular music and the dances. Up to then, always people have played some violins and danced the old quadrilles, but now they began to dance the cakewalk on music like this. I hope you can feel some of the excitement of your kinsmen in 1900. I think it's a really wonderful music, and Scott Joplin is really, I'm not kidding or making a slight half-tone joke, but I really mean Scott Joplin is one of the greatest composers of the 20th century in America. And music like this is not cheap. Of course, the Western society immediately made a commercialized, and in all the bars of all over the country, they played this music very badly, making it cheap, taking the depth out of it, taking the joy out of it. And that's not difficult to do, and you all know that, so I don't have to make illustrations about that. But this music went on, and so I have a second example of Scott Joplin. It's called The Entertainment. That's 1902, and then you will hear how this music was transferred into music that was played by bands, ragtime bands. And so you will hear first the music played, because these were piano compositions, very difficult music to play, and then it was transferred, particularly in New Orleans, whatever you say, by bands. The band, 19, 15, 14, 10. And of course people danced on this music, and this completely swept away all the violins and all the sweet, too sweet music that was played to dances that were too lifeless to be really dances. Of course, there were the old quadrilles, but quite different from what was danced in the time of Mozart, and so on. Now it has become a real lifeless cultural entertainment, And as such, culture is of course ephemeral, and entertainment is ephemeral, and so you have nothing left. It's completely dead. But this was really live music. It really meant something. And then we come into the next phase. And into the next phase, a very important man enters on the scene, Jim Europe. Jim Europe, who, and you will hear in a moment, his Missouri blues. The blues, in a way, were a rage in the years between 1910 and 20. Mr. Handy, W.C. Handy, heard some black people, real black people I will almost say, play very nice and very forceful music, and he thought, well, that's something that I can sell, and he was the first man to turn this blues, country, black music into something saleable, and so he called himself the father of the blues, but he rather was a stepfather of the blues, or certainly he was the man who made the money out of the blues. And so we have the Handy blues, for instance, in 1912 the Memphis blues is one of the first things. He got a statue and a square called after him in Memphis, but many of the unknown little people who really did it are forgotten. But so there is already a translation, but Jim Europe was a different person. Jim Europe was a very able musician who worked in New York. And he was the first to realize something out of this type of ragtime that you just heard. He worked this into something which was the first black entertainment music meant for white people to dance on. And he worked very closely with Irene and Castle. The Vernon and Castle were a couple who danced, and they introduced the new dances in New York. And of course, if Vernon and Irene Castle are doing something and it happens in New York in the upper classes, then very soon it's everywhere. And they introduced the Castle Walk, and they were the inventors of the foxtrot, which was everywhere. And they were the people who swept aside all the society dances of those days. But we must understand that the music that was played to these dances was black music by Jim Europe. Very good music. I'm sorry the record is old and doesn't really convey the strength of that music. But there's much more into it. Something of the permissiveness that we have in the 60s in it too. So maybe it's very interesting to read a little passage out of a book that Vernon and Irene Castle wrote in 1914. It was a manual for dancing. And the first part is just all technicalities. We go over this. But in 1914, Irene Castle wrote, and this is of course only meant for the ladies in this ensemble, so all the gentlemen close their ears. So, don't fasten your blouse too tightly. Don't fasten your blouse down too tightly. And be sure, in selecting one of the transparent, filmy little affairs now so much in vogue for dancing, that you can stretch your arms right above your head without difficulty. In speaking of hose, it may not come amiss to say that the new styles of stockings, with elastic tops that hold them up snugly with the aid of only a little round garter, are much better to dance in than the looser hose that required garters suspended from the corset. Drop the turkey trot, the grizzly bear, the bunny hop, these were these crazy dances of those days. These dances are ugly, ungraceful, and out of fashion. And she concluded, nowadays we dance morning, noon, and night. And what is more, we are unconsciously while we dance, warring not only against unnatural lines of figures and gowns, but we are warring against fat, against sickness, against nervous troubles. But what she does not say, we are warring against the society. We are warring against an old structure of the establishment which is tumbling down. The war was there in all this what you just heard. That was the permissiveness of that age. So, in 1913 we read in one of the society magazines of New York that Jim Europe was making syncopated music for the 400. And that was, of course, the white people. Just in between, Europe later went to Europe during the World War to organize the best brass band, the best military band that maybe ever existed, and he was very careful to make his lineup in this way that he could send out little groups, and so all over Europe and France we have Jim Europe's jazz, and this was the introduction of jazz into Europe. And it sounded something like this. This is the iron pill, and the next one is the man who tries to swallow it. And just listen, that's the entertainment music, 1916, the same year. Ray Miller, Black and White Melody Boys will be the next example. It's called Make Believe. It was indeed a make believe. Comes after this. So there you have it, Make Believe. Just swallow it very careful. And so we can understand that the man like Frisco, a musician who heard these musicians from New Orleans, he said, I'm going to try to do this. And one of his contributions, so here you have a man who tried to swallow it and did better, because in the other one really he tried to do something jazzy. But Frisco organized a jazz band, and one of the great successes, this is a top hit again, Super 10 top hit, Umbrellas to Mend, a very strange title, but there were many more strange titles in those days. Of course the word jazz was coming in, and you have many of these songs of those days, 1970, which are called Jazz Bow Jazz, Jazz Deluxe, Johnson Jazz Blues, and all that thing. But very interestingly, you also have songs that are called the Dada Strain, Shimmy Shama Wobble, and Bula Boo, and I don't know what. It's very interesting, that Dada Strain, it kept me thinking, because in 1917 in Europe a new movement began that called itself Dada. And what are the connections? Isn't it the same? People try to get rid of the past and begin a new world, just like, because Dada means the little hobby horse of the little children. So it is really a new beginning. Man saying Dada, start culture again, forget the past. Shimmy Shama Wobble, Jazz Go Jazz Deluxe. No, Umbrellas to Mend. But the real great thing happened when in 1918 the original Dixieland Jazz Band came to New York from Chicago, and there are some very interesting things to be said about them. So 1918, original Dixieland Jazz Band, a band coming down from New Orleans, being in Chicago for some time, having worked out a new thing, and then coming in New York, and that's where the scene really begins. New York is really in the center of all this. And the very first thing they say when people come up to them, the very first thing they say is, we cannot read music. And ever again since that time, if you ask a musician and he makes something original, he says, no, I'm a complete ignorant and I cannot read music. Of course, that was not true of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, and it has not been true of any of the other later artists. It's just a fake. But why do they say it? Because they want to be original, immediate, direct. What is in this is a kind of Rousseauic element. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, culture is just a facade, it's just a kind of thing which is your skin, but behind that is a real thing, and it becomes only real if you can express you immediately like that without culture. And so these people said, we are not culture, we don't know music, we are just immediately like this. There's an element of anti-culture, just like in the Dada. And of course they made also a record called the Dada Strain. But it is a novelty, and they had to, in a way, compromise a little bit, be a little bit commercial, and so had to be novelty, and they had to have some barnyard hokum. But there was a strong shift in dancing already in those days. Realize the dancing begins in 1911, and now in 1918 there's already a shift in dancing away from gentility, ballroom decorum, elegance of motion, to a franticer, jerkier, faster and snappier kind of dance. You see, so the revolution moves on. So the original Dixieland Jazz Band playing the Tiger Rack. Of course, a fantastic tiger. The tiger, just a symbol of everything that's strong, sexy, and so on. Certainly people in 1918 listened to this, and it was just as forceful or more forceful than today, the latest rock and roll or rock or whatever kind of record. This is very strong music. So they had swallowed their iron pill quite well. Didn't last long, very sorry, but they had it. The next example will be people who had great pain in their stomach about this. They were the real bourgeois of those days. It's a novelty band, and they have listened to this music, and they play, well, just listen a moment. And now we get the other thing. Of course, today is even worse. Everything goes worse. Today, the things go faster and stronger on the one hand and are more sentimental and crazy. This is Muzak today. It's the same thing. Around 1920, the real blues rage began. It was already there in the years before 1920, but after 1920, many blues artists were recorded. It began with Mamie Smith, who was recorded by Perry Bradford and his Jazz Hounds in 1920. That's the time that these black singers came forward. And when I say came forward, it means that they come now into the white society and sing for the white people. So you will hear in a moment Mary Stafford's Royal Garden Blues, and she sang this, of course, in many places in New York and cities like that. In 1922, she was part of a big blues contest in New York City, and the mayor of New York was there just to be the head of the jury, and they were all a all-white audience, and all the, Vernon Castle, for instance, was there too. So, Mary Stafford, and listen what she was singing, Royal Garden Blues, and everybody starts jazzing around. next example is Bessie Smith, who was maybe the greatest of these artists, or at least made the best records. And this is the Downhearted Blues, which is said to have saved CBS, which was almost broke, and then they released this record, and it was sold by the millions, and the record company was going good. Whether Bessie Smith did good, I don't know, that's another story. But this is 1923, and this is part of that bringing the iron pill into the 20th century. Bessie Smith.
But it's hard to love someone when that someone don't love you. I'm so disgusted, heartbroken too. I've got those downhearted blues. Once I was crazy about a man, he mistreated me all the time. The next man I get has got to promise me to be mine, all mine. Trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days. Trouble, I've had.
And the next example will be one of the most important, groups that maybe was ever there in jazz. It's a recording by King Oliver. King Oliver's original Creole jazz band, playing in Chicago. They came from New Orleans, and it's called the Dippermouth Blues, this example which you will hear. Dippermouth Blues, Dippermouth being a nickname for Louis Armstrong, who was part in the band. So you have King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, and different other very important people. They play with mutes, their trumpets, new sounds. They play in the Chicago South Side, but we must understand when it is in the Chicago South Side, in the black part of the city, that this was attended very much by the white people, and they listened very careful, and they tried to swallow this type of music, and just like to think about what it is. So here you can look at in two ways to listen to this music which you will hear in a moment. You can listen in two ways, and in a way in this lecture try to have both. One is listen to it as a music in itself, coming out of a black culture with a no Western culture background. Of course, there's some influences of white music, of brass band music and so on, of course. But it is a music that comes out of a different mentality, out of a different world. And I would call this pre-Enlightenment music. It is music, and in another lecture on jazz many years ago, I've tried to show that this music is very near to Bach. And I showed examples just to show you how similar it was. Although I'm sure King Oliver never heard Bach, but the music comes out of the same mentality. And most of these people are coming from Christian families, and none of them rejected Christianity. This music is maybe not made by very much strong Bible-believing, church-going people, but they were certainly not anti-Christians. It's not a modern world. They were going to church, and they were hard-working, and this is now rightly used, middle-class men, working very hard to earn a living, and were wonderful musicians. Being black, they were never allowed to go into the high place in the concert halls. No, they played somewhere in some nightclub in Chicago, but that's not their fault. And it is a very strong pre-Enlightenment music. It's dance music, yes. It's rhythm, yes. But it's wonderful music. It's not just rhythm. It's deep and joyful at the same time. And nothing in the Western world since the Enlightenment has been deep and joyful. We can have joy, and then it's superficial, or it's deep, and then it's dead and despair and everything. But here's something else. This is one side to look at it. The other side to look at King Oliver is to look with a Western man's eye. And what do you hear? This is Rousseau. This is the man who is completely free. You see, this is rhythm. This is Africa. And Africa means the original, authentic man before culture began. It is the real primordial music, the real man. And so they wanted to have this anti-culture, lawless, new music, with these strange sounds that just blew away all the sicknesses and the deadness in their own age. They were looking here at the inspirations of a primeval past. Of course, that's all fake, but that's the way they understood it, and that's what the young man in Chicago understood when they were sitting down and listening to King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, Johnny Dodds, and the rest of them. So listen now to the Dipper Mouth Blues, 1923, in a two-world version. As you hear, it's polyphony, which was completely unknown in the Western world at that moment. So just such muted trumpets, they are completely unknown in those days. They were new sounds, irrational sounds, crazy sounds, unlawful sounds, going against everything that's considered music. That's the white man's side, and that's why he loved it, and that's why he took it. I wished that at those days there would have been very fine, musically trained evangelicals who had understood that's not this type of Rousseauic music, but that's really like Bach and pre-Enlightenment. I think the world would have been different, and the music history would have been different. I'm sorry it never happened. They were probably still asleep with the old entertainment music and their nice little hymns. The white man, of course, tried to copy this, and he began to play things like this. So you have a white man just in the same year. These were the boys who were sitting down at the bandstand listening to King Oliver, and they tried to play it too. The New Orleans Rhythm Kings, a white group. The very interesting thing about this, it's a little bit sweet. The iron pill is very hard to swallow, really. But the very interesting thing is that there's one black man in the group, Jerry Roll Morton, one of the greatest jazz musicians. And so we see that jazz did something very important in American history. It brought black and white men together to do a job, making music. For many reasons, musicians come from New Orleans in this field. And so you have Oliver Naylor, just a dance band coming from New Orleans to New York, playing with the influence of these new things that you've just been listening to, trying to accommodate it to the Western. It's like this. This is 1924. Ditty of the day, popular music in those days. David Cassidy in those days, probably, something like that. There were also black bands coming, so you have Armand Piron, and the next example is very interesting because this Piron band plays one of these stock arrangements. They had stock arrangements, the arrangements were pre-printed, and the band just played it. And you hear here how this band begins to play the stock arrangement and then goes into their own thing, more or less. And the way they play it, of course, is so lively and so real that you almost forget that this is just one of those stock things, pre-arranged, pre-made. They played in the Roseland, which was one of the most important nightclubs in New York, where people danced, and of course it's just for a wide audience. You hear how this music is on the one hand coming from the stock arrangements already making it down, but on the other hand how these musicians really tried to keep the iron going on. Of course they were black people themselves, but they were in New York and they came from New Orleans and they were very homesick, so very soon they were back home again. And their place was taken in by Fletcher Henderson, one of the most well-known jazz bands later on. But do understand, all these black people played for the white man who tries to take this music because there's nothing in his own culture that can provide something which is joyful and yet deep, something which is real and authentic. And they tried to swallow it, but it was hard to swallow and they never succeeded. And that's a tragedy of it, because there was in a way no stomach to really digest it. So this is Fletcher Henderson, again playing in the Roseland after Piron had gone back to New Orleans. This 1923 that we're talking about now. In 1925, something very important happened. The new electric recording was invented. And so the recordings were much better after that. And it was a great luck for all of us that just after that day and not before, one of the most important jazz musicians made one of his most important sessions of recording. It's Jerry Roll Morton. And of course, very aptly, his records were sold under the name of Gerald Morton's Red Hot Peppers. You see the hotness and the strength and it burns into your mouth and it burns into your stomach. It's what I call the iron pill. That's just another metaphor. The Red Hot Peppers, maybe that's a better one. And this record, in what you're going to hear in a moment, Dr. Jazz by Yellow Morton, and I think, again, you can look at it from two sides. Look at it from the black man's side, and it's pre-enlightenment, real music, with real joy and real meaning. Look at it from the other side, and it's an exuberant, going through all the laws and all the things, and trying to establish in a Rousseauic way the new free man. But it does not succeed because there's no bass, and it is a real modern thing that we are listening to. So you got to look at it from two sides. Of course, the white man was trying to sell this in the white point of view, as I just tried to lay it down, and it sounds like this. So this is from an advertisement of 1925, when this record was made, of the record company. And they try, of course, to sell it, and they sold it by these words: Foxtrot, by colored dance band, hot style, vocal refrain, barbaric melody, sustained notes, wild barbaric record, crude strong color, good rhythm, loud record, many freak and mute effects, and so on. You see, this is all that there is. This is the line, you have to listen to it. And again, you must listen also from the other side. So again, Foxtrot, hot style, barbaric melody, wild barbaric record, crude, strong, good rhythm, loud record. Well, let's listen to the loudness. And there's nothing crude to this very refined and very fine music. There's nothing crude, there's nothing loud, there's nothing barbaric here. Wild, post-enlightenment, romantic ears, the next thing might call wild, when we just go on and we listen to this. But it was not intended to be wild, it's just fantastically real. That gets me fixed. Hello, Sandra, give me that jazz. In the 30s and the 40s, people who have lived through this age have begun to write the saga of jazz. And the saga is about this wild, uncontrolled, well, of course, jazz had to be born into the bordellos in the red light district of New Orleans. That's the only place something like this can come, because then it's sexy and unlawful, and that's the good place to be. But of course, that's all a saga and a legend, simply not true. In the red light district, they never play this sound of music. It's simply too loud, because it is in a way loud. But there were also some intelligent people who at least understood something of it. So, for instance, you have Rudy Blesch. Rudy Blesch, who in the 40s, early 40s, wrote a fantastic good book on jazz. And I think that it were recollections of his own youth when he writes some of these almost poetic words about the record that I'm going to play in a moment. Gerald Morton's Black Bottom Stomp, made in the same day, 1926. He says this is it. On these records, Gerald Morton seems to say, here is what jazz is. Here where it came from, what it's made of, and here I am. And then he goes on, the first strains of Black Bottom Stomp are black-faced minstrel music coming from a tent show of Reconstruction days. From these lightly skipping, haunting, melodious measures, the hoarse, laughing, sliding trombone seems to call 1870. Dreamlike, the music merges into a country dance on the outskirts of New Orleans. The clarinets, imitating the rural fiddler, seems to sing on a twangling string, 1880. A short, high coronet fanfare truth is repeated as the street band approaches. Suddenly the full golden blare of the marching brass buds on the ear. 1890. Everyone rushes in great excitement out of the dance hall to follow the band. Liltingly the music lures them along down Canal, over Golfers, past Basin Street, past Rampart Street and Royal. The followers linger, peeping through antique doorways into dim interiors. 1905. Through one such doorways, framed with lacy ironwork, a crowded saloon is revealed. In the corner a trio is playing through the noise, clarinet, string bass, piano. Next door is a honky-tonk. In the corner at the battered upright piano sits Mr. Jerry Morton himself, professor of the Tenderloin, playing his ragtime as delicate, yet strong, as precise, as dainty, as French, as porcelain. 1910, and he goes on and he ends up with this. An even greater sureness, an even greater exuberance, the music swells out, dances on. 1926. Listen very careful, because this is music played to the popular dance of those days, the Charleston, and in a moment you will hear again what the white entertainment music made out of this, after having tried to swallow a little bit of the iron pill. Listen to Johnny Ham's Kentucky Serenaders. He tries to be wild too. Yeah. In 1926 there was a group of singers who were very, very popular. I think the very old among you may remember, the Revelers, and they sing the Charleston. Something like this comes out of this. The record is completely wrecked because it has been played so much in those days. Great, great record. The latest top hit. just keep it going on, because I think it's for young people good to understand what their elder people were listening to, what their parents didn't like them to listen to. In those days, well, you almost can follow the trends of the revolution by the length of the skirt. So in the 1920s, the skirt went real short, and you had the short-dressed girl. And I found a very nice, interesting record by a New Orleans jazz group on the short-dressed girl. Just listen. Band that was very popular in those days was Ted Lewis, and this is the kind of, well, this belongs to the jazz age of Mr. Scott Fitzgerald.
Hey folks, come on, put all your troubles away. I'll down. Why, I've done declared this a good old jazz holiday. Hello, boy, buddy. When the clock strikes 9:30, we'll step right down the line. When we dance that Zulu twist, not a movement will be missed for sugar sweet. So come on, get your dancing shoes. Well, we'll step right out. Honey, there's no time that we can lose. Cause when I'm blue and I lose my speed, a little jazz music, that's all I need. So I solemnly declare this to be a good old jazz holiday.
The next is by the California Ramblers, another very popular band in that time. And I just tried to show you how to try to swallow something, how there was this revolution in it, at the same time making it to a kind of holiday out of the world. They were not politically interested yet. That is coming later, although these things have political implications. But the California Ramblers start to, it's again completely missing the point. Although they had swallowed all this, or had these dreams of being lawless, new, wild, unrestricted, just listen. It's as sweet as can be. Only the trumpet, listen to the trumpet. Where does the trumpet get that from? He get that from listening to a very important white trumpeter, Bix Beiderbecke, who was, of course, influenced by the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, by King Oliver's Dixieland Creole Jazz Band, and very much by Louis Armstrong. Listen to him, Bix Beiderbecke. Bix Beiderbecke was really one of the most important white men to really understand, or at least come to a certain point to understanding of what it was all about. But very tellingly, he'd never had a chance really to play his music. We have a few records of his that are really something in the line that he wanted it to be, because he had to make his living and to play in the band of Paul Whiteman, who styled himself to be the king of jazz. It's very interesting. All the records you're hearing today are out of my own collection, And I don't have one record by Paul Whiteman, I'm so sorry, because that's music of the King of Jazz. But if you listen to it, well, there are some few little notes by Bix Beiderbecke, but for the rest, it's the sweetest of sweet music. I remember when I was a boy, 10 years old, my aunt told me, you know, jazz, that's Paul Whiteman. That's the wilder thing to come now. Paul Whiteman, the king of jazz. And do you know how he invented jazz? Well, it's like this. He sat in his living room, and somebody had such glass rooms, doors like this, you know, and somebody came, and the door slapped, and all the glass broke down, and there was much noise, and he says, that is jazz. And that's how he made his music. It's very strange that this music, I always tried to find this noise, this great noise that my aunt was talking about. I never found it, but it's strange that she was talking about. And it tells you something of the ideals and the not realizing, the wanting to and not be able to. Louis Armstrong, another case. Louis Armstrong was, of course, a black man, one of the greatest of the musicians, and he was, well, taken in by the white man and misused in a way. They made him into a Rousseauistic, exuberant, self-exhibiting musician. In 1926, that was in the time he was still good, he played a record, and this became one of the great things in Chicago and New York in those days. In the Heebie-Jeebies, he plays for the first time in history maybe a song which has no words. And he says skit, scat, and so on. And everybody meeting each other in the street would address themselves over the street with words like this and would be answered by the other fellow by the rest of the record. So this is something of this wildness, this exuberance, this freedom, this free speech, and so on, that we have today already in 1926 after, and it's inbuilt in such a record like this. Heebie-Jeebies.
Come on down to that dance. They call the heebie-jeebies dance. Sweet mama, Papa got to do the heebie-jeebies dance. What's going with the heathens? I just had to have the heathens.
For myself, the importance of such a lecture like this is that I'm always talking about these very important, very learned people that people write books about and that they have their works hanging in the museum. This very refined superculture of the elite called, which makes the Dada and Surrealism. But if you just go down to the street and you listen, it's the same thing. And if you see the boys just walking down the street of New York, they will talk to each other like this, and it's the same thing.
Woo! Got the heebie-jeebies. What's going with the heathens? I just had to have the heathens.
Very soon they made Louis Armstrong into the great exhibitionistic, individualistic, great Western type, Western culture type soloist. Of course he could do it, and that was great. And so I just give you one example. We very soon go into the end. Don't get impatient. It's almost the end of the lecture, so a few minutes more. So what I mean is that the old spirit is gone, the pre-enlightenment is going into post-enlightenment here. But it's still strong. You will hear Louis Armstrong play one of his most daring, very forceful solos. It's just on the brink of being the possibilities of music. It's great to do this, but it's the beginning of the end. This is, of course, Johnny Dodds. Something hard in it, very strong, which is different from the early one. The early is strong, but in a way lovingly and has a lilting, soft quality. This is very strong and forceful, slaps you in the face. That's the difference. That's the beginning of what I would say the end or the change. 1928, Duke Ellington, maybe the greatest of, one of the greatest of the Negro musicians, but then in another way, he just translated all this for the white man's world. So he played many years in the Cotton Club in New York, which was a club where the girls, of course, black girls, of course not two black girls, would dance jungle style things, African things, the African jungle, and it was completely made up and decorated as the African jungle, and there on Lexington and 142nd he would play, of course one of his first numbers that he was playing there was Jazz Mania, another was Dance Mania, and the critic of those days talked about Ellington Jazz Ziek. Ellington Jazz Ziek. I think that's a very nice way of speaking it. But he made fine music, although it is a very much so the jungleistic, Rousseauistic, naturalistic, whatsoistic a type of Duke Ellington is the change where you see people trying, well, this is the iron pill, which was so hard to swallow for the public, who came there to look at that strange phenomenon with dreamy eyes, trying to realize it, but they were already too dead. And that's the tragedy of it. The mooch. And of course here the jungle sounds are very much worked out deliberately for white man's ears, your ears. Must try to understand this ambience, decorations, African jungles, palms, semi-nude girls, black dancing, witches dances, orgy dances, tom-tom dances, to a kind of music like this, which is African-like, just because this is the old original man. And in a moment you will hear the wild love cry. Sex is in this too. Of course, this was only for the 400 or maybe 4,000 of New York. What were the college kids dancing on? They were dancing on the same kinds of bands, the same kind of music, not that chic, not that worked out, not that ambience, just the college dance, Benny Moten's Kansas City Orchestra and many others, Hot Water Blues, something like this. The music strong in rhythm. There's something very fine qualities, and again the white kids were looking for something real and authentic, and they got it. And the white people tried to imitate it, and they never got it, because it's too hard to swallow. The same things that happened in the 60s. People listened to the black blues and so on, and the white never bait it, because there's no foundation to build on. They want to have a revolution, but it always falls back into the nothingness. So the next example will be very nice, I'm sure she was very nice, white entertainer singing the Dallas Blues. Happily Louis Armstrong heard the song sung once, and he made some music out of it. That's the last example. And then we will go in a little coda seeing what goes next. This is somebody for who the iron pill was really too hard to swallow, although it is the blues, nevertheless.
I got down the blues and the rain, sweetheart disease. The ground was around my head, like a small little honeybee. A honeybee. I wonder if I...
And now Louis Armstrong.
Got that little baby on the sea, all buzzing around
myself on a strategy and go. I'm going to go. Gonna put myself on a strategy and go. I'm going to go to the Texas town where they never see ice and snow. Snow.
1929, that's the end. Money, camel down, just like today. It's resembled so much our own days. The skirts got lower again, and much of this impetus. This is one of the last records which is still music in that sense. It's the end of the jazz age. I totally agree with Scott Switzerland on that point. And the first revolution was over. And the tragedy of it is, and it's the same tragedy in the 60s, people were looking for life, and they were looking for something real, and they were looking for something authentic, and it was nowhere to be found. And he went to, well, something that they considered wild, original, lawless, something which was a Rousseau, which was let yourself go. They went permissive in their sex, just like in the 20s. They made their music wild, and they just let themselves go. They added the drugs this time, which was worse. And they did not succeed. Why? Because there is no base to build on. And even the good things that were offered them in, for instance, this black man's music, they were even not able to understand. They had to dilute it, and of course very soon it was, and that's the other side of the American society, it was commercialized, put into the real, true establishment, capitalist molds, and then it's really finished. It becomes completely plastic, because plastic is cheap and saleable and a commodity, and you can offer it in the supermarket. This was what happened also in that time in those days, in that way. And so I have two little records now to end with, and I just chose them because I made this record originally for England. I chose them out of England, but in America it's just the same. So here you have first an English band who tries to play in 1930 the Tiger Rag. Here comes Jack Hilton, one of the most popular jazz dance bands in London. And again, it is a triad, and a complete loss. And we here in La Brie, we talk often about technocracy, we talk about the mechanistic side of man being put in the box, being a machine and so on. Well, this is also reflected in the music. So in a moment you will hear Lou Stone, English band, play Meilenberg Joyce. The number is by Gerald Morton. The number is good, but it's played in a kind of stock arrangement again, coming from Glenn Gray's Casa Loma Orchestra, and this orchestra was famous for having the perfect music, mechanistic, mechanic, machine sound. It was just a machine. It's the jukebox of jukeboxes, it is the machines of machines, and it was the end of jazz. This is still the Tiger Rag, the Jack Hilton one. It's still some life in this. But now the rest begins. So here at the machine. Listen to the machine. And we can weep at the way Western culture was able to make something so ugly, so lifeless, out of something that was so beautiful and full of life. And all the depth and all the joy has become something mechanic. There's no joy and there's no depth anymore. It's the death of man. It's a dead man who cannot produce life. That's the great problem. And so if we are people who are alive, at least think ourselves alive, let's produce some life, please. So that was what I had to say. I hope I've become...
So there you are, Hans Rookmaaker's version of the Jazz Age. And what you can see, let me just kind of recap for you, since he doesn't exactly do it himself, is that you can see that there is a lot of influence from particularly the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau was the person who invented the concept of the noble savage. And what happened in the 1920s was the educated white people, particularly in Chicago, started listening to jazz and then started reinterpreting it as these were the noble savages. That this music was a wild music. Part of the mythology is that it was born in the bordellos. As Rookmaaker said, yeah, maybe Jelly Roll Morton or some of these people played the piano in a bordello or whorehouse. But that a jazz band would be much too loud and big for a place like that. These were not loud establishments. So jazz was not born in the bordellos of New Orleans. Another aspect of the mythology is that, and this is how the early viewpoint of the white Europeanized listeners was that it was a wild music. And Rookmaaker points out it's not wild. However, it started to take on aspects of that the more that the performers began to perform for these audiences that had an expectation. And so you start getting into a phase where people are all, Louis Armstrong, you saw in that one clip from the 1930s, is dressed like he's just out of the jungle. Now, the jungle motif is really big. Often you'll hear, in another lecture, he quotes from different advertisements for music at the times, and he'll talk about, they would say freak mood affects, and they would give it this idea that you're buying this strange jungle music, when of course you weren't. But some of the musicians began to play into that more. Louis Armstrong, and his contention is Louis Armstrong, and Rookmaaker's contention is that Louis Armstrong began to show much more emotion in his music than he had been at the beginning. That is, that the early jazz from King Oliver and Louis Armstrong's early music did not have these elements, but that suddenly he's kind of overblowing the notes, which of course was really appreciated as a sign of this casting off the shackles of the old European society, the old bourgeois society. And eventually jazz began to change. Another way it begins to change at the end is that it becomes commercialized and more mechanical. And Rookmaaker was not much of a fan of swing music. And he says that's when the swing riffs and stuff is when you start to get the really commercial stuff. But we're not going into that in this lecture. It's very similar to what happened with rock music. So, thanks for watching. By the way, you can get a copy of my book of Strange Little Puppet Plays. You might not have any interest in the world in puppets, but you want to support the channel, don't you? And what I need from everyone is I'm charging $25. That gives me about a few dollars to mail it, a few dollars for the people who'll be doing the mailing since I can't do it from here, and the rest goes to the channel. So please do that. When you go into the description section and find the link, it's the usual links, PayPal or GoFundMe. Just make sure you write the word book and that way I'll know it's not a normal contribution, but it is a special book contribution. And then you'll have it sent to you. I have 50 copies, well actually 49 in America and 30 in Europe, and they won't last long. This is all there is. So it's a real souvenir. It's something. And if you're really creative, you can get in touch with me and I'll send you a bunch if you want to put on the plays, if you want to know how many plays you need. It would be good for a young theater troupe to make puppet plays out of. Anyway, subscribe, share, like, hit the notification bell if you want to know when I'm dropping these videos. And thanks for coming. And as the Georgians say, droabit, we will meet again. Nachwamdis.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
And I think to myself, what I want to do. I see skies of blue, clouds white, bright, bright,